Hello and welcome to Noel's Retro Lab. Growing up, I had a joystick just like this for my Amstrad CPC 6128, and I have the picture to prove it. No, it wasn't a very good joystick. But since the Amstrad only had one joystick port, I assumed that this is all you could connect, and if it was a two-player game, the other player would have to use the keyboard. Well, I was completely wrong. It turns out the joystick port supports two joysticks at once. So join me today as we're going to build some homemade gamepads and a splitter to be able to play two-player games with two joysticks on the Amstrad. As you may have seen in a recent Mail Day video, I got this gamepad kit from Alistair Gillespie. There, I pronounced your last name correctly this time, I hope. Better known as Geek or Geek.net. I think the idea is super cool, so I wanted to buy these from him, but he actually sent them to me free of charge. Full disclosure there. However, this is just my experience building them and trying them without any strings attached. If by the end you're interested in getting your own, I recommend you check out his webpage. He has a contact form there, or you can even contact him directly on Twitter. Having said that, let's get started. So this is the whole kit for the gamepads for the Amstrad, or really maybe for other systems as well, plus the splitter, and this is where the magic happens that allows us to connect two gamepads simultaneously to the Amstrad. And then we have the cables, which is really convenient. So one would go from this to the Amstrad, and then each of those will connect to the splitter. And then each of those gamepads has their own pieces inside. So let's start just by building a gamepad and trying it and see how that works. And then we'll build the second one, then we'll build the splitter and try the whole thing together. So the gamepad itself is super simple. It's really this board, some buttons, and a cable. That's about it. The rest is the super cool case, optional this way, or you can have it NES style this way. We'll try both ways and see which one feels better. Some 3D printed buttons, and the contents here should just be, we have some buttons that just go directly on the board, like that. And we have some pin headers that go there, and then some connectors for the cables, so then they can plug in there, but not permanently, and they come out through the back of the case. So this is actually extremely simple to build. It's just a few through-hole components. So it's so simple, I'm going to see if my daughter is interested in building this with me. It didn't take much convincing, and here she is. Since the buttons are the lowest profile piece, she's starting with those. Again, this is a great kit for kids or people learning because the components are very simple, they're easy to handle, they're all the same, all the buttons are the same, all the diodes are the same. So it's actually great for learning how to solder. Okay, I guess I'll take over now. She did an amazing job. Look at that, the joints look pretty good. Not bad at all for a 9-year-old. Okay, so next thing we need to do is put the pin headers, and it's not totally obvious, but they actually need to point down this way. And the idea is that the connectors connect here and the cable goes through the PCB out this way, and that will help a little bit with stress relief. Next, we need to crimp the metal connectors at the end of those tiny cables and put one of these plastic DuPont connectors at the end so we can slide them into the pin header. And in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is strip these wires a little bit more, leave like, I don't know, 3 millimeters exposed. And these are too small for my wire strippers like these, like you put them in the smallest gauge and it doesn't do anything. So in a case like this, there may be other simpler methods, but I just do it with a lighter. Just burn the end and slide it away. And there you go. Next, for the actual crimping, I'm going to use this tool, which is very handy. I first need to place this the metal part right there. Like that. And now slide the cable inside like that, and now I press it all the way. There you go. And then this, we need to slide inside this. Like that. I don't know if you heard a little click, but it clicked in place. And now this is perfect. Now it can go into one of the headers. So now we need to repeat the same thing with the other 8 cables. Sometimes it can be a pain to put the wire through the metal connector to be able to crimp it in place, because the little strands keep coming undone. And this is so thin that it's hard to even twist and keep it all together. So one thing that helps sometimes is to tin this as if we were going to solder it. It just keeps it all together. Just like that. Now this should be really easy to slide through and crimp. There you go. And that's all 9 of them. I just realized this would have been a lot easier had I passed it through the hole before I did this. Hopefully, we're going to still do it a few at a time. But yeah, this is something it would have been better to do earlier for sure. It looks like we can do it one at a time just fine. And there you go. And now we can pull this through. And now we need to follow the directions in the web page to know which cable goes where, or we can figure out very easily because you see the traces. So you see that, oh, up is this one, and fire 1 is this one, and that. But it's much easier to follow just what's in the page. So I will do that. I'm actually concerned about this staying in place. It doesn't seem to stay very well. We may have to put some tape. So now that they're all in place, they're actually kind of pushing against each other, and it seems pretty good. I may still put some tape over the whole thing just to give it a little bit more friction. Like that is definitely not going to go anywhere. And now all we have to do is put it back inside. So the 3D printed buttons just go on top like that, and something with that. Maybe this will be easier to build the other way around, now that I think about it. Like this. Wouldn't that be easier? You can even guide this in place like that, and like that. This is great. Yeah. And how about inside this? Yeah, this fits perfectly. Very cool. Let's go ahead and test it on the Amstrad. Featuring again our great helper. And it looks like it works perfectly. Yay! The PCB for the gamepad looks so simple because these joysticks are really simple. A digital joystick is just several buttons, up, down, left, right, and one or more fire buttons. Each of those buttons is a little switch that can be on or off with a wire running from the AY chip, in the case of the Amstrad, to the button itself and to ground. The Amstrad sets each track at 5 volts, so when you close the switch, you get a short circuit. Wait, that's not what we wanted. In reality, the AY chip has an internal pull-up resistor on each of those tracks, so you aren't connecting 5 volts directly to ground. With the switch off, the track stays at 5 volts, but as soon as the button is pressed, the majority of the voltage drop happens across the pull-up resistor, and the AY chip sees the track at 0 volts. That's the signal that indicates that the button was pressed in the joystick. And what about the rest of the buttons? Each of them has their own pin on the AY chip and their own cable running from the computer to the button. That's why the joystick connector has 9 pins. This is mostly how Atari joysticks work, and a lot of other semi-compatible ones like Commodore 64, Amiga, MSX, even though there are actually small differences between them. We'll cover those in a future episode. I finished building the second controller exactly the same way, so very nice feel to it. And now we have the option to put it inside the bigger case if we want. One thing that I was wondering about earlier before is, what's up with those 3 holes? Well, those 3 holes are very convenient if you, put in the pad, which is pretty tight fit, like that, right? Without the holes, it's impossible to take this out. So if you want to get it out now, you can just push with a screwdriver or something carefully, maybe something plastic would be better, and it pops right out. But I think for now we're going to use it with the nice extra holder. So let's give this one a try. Sorcery is one of my favorite games that makes it perfect for testing this. It's joystick only, and it has some sections that were always very challenging to control with a joystick. Trying to enter those doors over the water without falling in was always extremely challenging. Especially so because the water doesn't just drain energy like the monsters, but it's an instant kill. I've thrown my share of joysticks across the room trying to play this game, but with this gamepad the controls are great, and it doesn't even feel dangerous to hover over the water. This is awesome. Where was this pad 35 years ago? Next, we'll assemble the splitter, which is where the magic happens. So how exactly does the Amstrad manage to read 2 different joysticks with only 1 port? After all, if you press a button in one, it closes the circuit and brings the track to ground, so you'd know that a particular button was pressed, but you wouldn't know in which of the joysticks the press happened. If you had to solve the problem, you may be tempted to add an extra signal going to both joysticks. When the select signal is 0, one of the joysticks can send its button signals, and when it's 1, the other one does it. That would sort of work, but it would actually be really bad design. That would require joysticks to be marked as 1 or 2, so they would know which signal to respond to. Kind of like the old master-slave hard drives. Remember how much fun that was? But even more problematic is that each joystick would have to have extra logic in them. They would need to block their button signals until the select line was at the correct level, and that requires extra logic, extra cost, and worst of all, it would make them incompatible with other systems. Bad design. The solution Amstrad went with is actually really elegant. The computer runs separate ground lines to each joystick, COM and COM2. Normally these lines are open, so even if buttons are pressed in the joystick, nothing happens. Then 50 times per second, the computer closes one of the switches and checks the button lines. And then immediately it does it with the other switch and checks for the button presses again. That way we know which joystick they're coming from. That means that all the splitter PCB does is to connect the COM signal as the ground to one joystick and the COM2 signal as the ground to the other joystick. This design is efficient, cheap, and doesn't involve any modification of the joysticks themselves. Win-win. Here we have a bunch of diodes to make sure that both joysticks can be plugged in at the same time and the signals don't interfere with each other. Then there's another header in there to connect another cable, and there's going to be this cable going to the computer, and the D-sub-9 joystick ports are going to go in there. So again, pretty simple. Let's start with the smallest component, which are the diodes. And once again, we have our helper. This time she learned about diodes, and we had a quick demonstration of how they conduct current one way and not the other. So she learned how to place them correctly on the PCB. And yeah, she did a fantastic job with them. So next, we need to crimp those cables and connect them here and assemble everything and test it. All right, there they are. And again, I'm going to put some tape to hold them in place. Yeah, I think a different connection mechanism here would be better. I don't know exactly what would be, the best thing, some kind of Molex connector, or I don't know, maybe even soldered directly, but this is a little fiddly. And now we put those big screws right there. Oh, interesting, they have a different head. It looks like some kind of hex. But not a problem, we can handle it. Now that I think about it, maybe it was a little premature to close the box like this before testing it, but hey, I have a feeling it's gonna work first try. And let's connect the gamepad. Oh, it looks like most of the buttons aren't working. There's something wrong with this. So it seems that some of those pins are not making good contact with this, because I also did the same test, and the same buttons failed with joystick 2. So I'm inclined to think that it's probably something here with this connection. I just jammed them in really hard. Well, not really hard, but I jammed them in with the screwdriver and then even pushed the metal bit in the back. So they're a lot more firm than they were before. Let's do a quick test. Let's try, is that 6 or 9? I never know the order. Yeah, 6, okay. Okay, that looks more promising. Let's try it again. Okay, let's try this again. Yeah, much better. And what about the other port? There you go. Different characters, because this actually recognizes that is joystick number 2. I had actually never seen this before because I never had a joystick 2. So this is great. Well, I think we need to put it in action now. All right, let's try to look at some of the joystick signals. So these are kind of difficult to see actually because of the nature of the signals is that they're disconnected most of the time. So right now the board is not even powered on, and we are already seeing some capacitive signals. So in fact, maybe if I pass my hand on top, they may grow, or if I touch it, sometimes they do. Yeah, like if I touch the cables. So this means pretty much nothing. It's just there's no power there. The oscilloscope is trying to interpret some things. It's picking up some interference. So when I power the board on, that signal doesn't change that much, because right now this is the COM signal. So it's varying between grounded and not grounded. But the circuit is not connected because nothing else is pressed on some of the other joysticks. So that's why we just see the same thing as if the board wasn't even powered on. Right now we're only looking at the yellow signal, that's channel 1. And yeah, when I do that, then we see that every so often it goes low and the rest of the time is high because the circuit is closed. So that makes sense. And if we look at COM2, which is pin 7 right there, it looks like it's not doing anything, it's just floating around, and that's because we're using joystick 1 in here. If I activate a button in joystick 2, then the same thing happens on this one, and it's not set up to trigger. So there's a small amount of time where it goes to ground and tries to read buttons from joystick 2. So right now I've hooked up both probes, one to COM and one to COM2. And if I trigger both joysticks, we're going to see how both those signals go to ground, but at different times. There you go. So first we have the blue one, which is COM, and then the yellow one, or the other way around actually. So yeah, interesting. So the blue one is COM2 and COM is triggered right after that, but within a few milliseconds of each other, or maybe even less. And that's how the Amstrad can tell whether a button press comes from one joystick or another. Another really important question, especially from a performance game development point of view, is How often does the computer really check the signal from the joystick? I've read in the documentation that it does it every 50 hertz, so 50 times per second. Is that true? Let's measure it. We can do that very easily the way we're set up here. So I'm going to turn it on. And right now I'm only displaying the COM1, so only joystick 1. And I need to zoom out until I see the other one, because every single one of those pulses means the computer is checking the state of the joystick. So it happens here, and then it happens there again, and we're at 4 milliseconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It happens every 5 squares. 5 times 4 is 20 milliseconds, which is exactly 50 hertz. So yes, the documentation was not lying. The reason this is really important for game development is so you know the potential lag that the player input has. If the player unfortunately presses a button right here, it's not, in the best case, is not going to be detected until after the Amstrad checks again. And then maybe your program even checks later. So it could have 40 milliseconds. No, we decided this was 20 milliseconds. So yeah, it could have almost 40 millisecond delay before your program checks, assuming it checks every frame, which it should. But this is a good way to visualize that. As for multiplayer games, I wanted to find some of the best ones, so I asked on Twitter. Quickly, I got some replies with great suggestions, so I loaded them up on a USB card and set out to test them. Since they're multiplayer games and I couldn't do it by myself, my little helper had to make a great sacrifice and help me test them all afternoon. We decided to start with the classics. Rampage seemed like a great starting point, but much to our disappointment, we couldn't get the game to work with the second joystick. Bummer. No big deal though. Let's move on to the next one. So we loaded Exterminator, this weird kind of first-person shooter where what you need to do is swat insects away. Apart from not having very intuitive controls, again, it would let us play with joystick and keyboard, but not two joysticks. What's going on? Zybots wasn't our cup of tea, but we tried it and same thing. Wow, so many games with co-op multiplayer that don't support two joysticks. I guess I wasn't the only one who didn't know about it back in the day. Even Rodland, released in 1991 towards the end of the commercial life of the CPC, seems to work in that you can move around with two joysticks, but it won't recognize the fire button on the second joystick. Wow, this is really disappointing so far. Fortunately, that was just a bad start. We moved on to Gauntlet, and that was pure co-op bliss. Controls were crisp, precise, and the movement fluid. This is exactly how a co-op game should be. We tried a few others, like Ikari Warriors or Wells and Fargo, and while they worked, they weren't nearly as much fun. I left Whizball for last because it has a reputation for being an awesome co-op game with asymmetrical powers, which tends to make games much more interesting. Unfortunately, it's not just that it doesn't support two joysticks, it's that the two-player mode was completely left out of the Amstrad version as far as I can see. Wow, that's incredible. Moving on to modern games, I had to try Bubble Bobble 4 CPC, a 2011 remake of the arcade classic that already had a port in the 80s. I'm usually not big on arcade game ports because I can always play them better on MAME, but I'm happy to report that this is co-op multiplayer on the Amstrad as it should be. It even supports the two fire buttons, one for making bubbles and one for jumping, just like the arcade version. We also went to look at Mega Blaster's Escape from Castle in the Clouds from 2015, which looks to be some kind of Bomberman-inspired game, but comes highly recommended for multiplayer. And when I go to configure the controls, oh no, another one that only allows joystick and keyboard. Seriously, this is getting annoying. It's kind of incredible that a modern game will have such an oversight. So, looking for more modern games, I looked through the list of the recent CPC Retro Dev 2020 competition. I started with Sorceress, which not only won the second Best Game award, but also won the Best Music award by none other than the awesome McLean, who also created a lot of the music I use in this channel. But also the Best Multiplayer award by, you guessed it, geek.net. It was a lot of fun, and it worked flawlessly with 2 joysticks. Finally, we spent a while playing the highlight game of the competition for me. I know it only got 7th place and no specific awards, but Ms. Input 2 was the most 2-player gaming fun we had together all afternoon. It supported both joysticks no problem. It's a platformer game with modern sensibilities, with heavy inspirations from Super Meat Boy and VVVVVVV, however you pronounce it. It was fluid, fast, and furious. It was really hard to put down, so it was really nice to end our gaming session on such a positive note. So there you go. Those gamepads are actually great. And the splitter is a game changer. I mean, it feels like a console, the fact that we can sit 2 players side by side and play with gamepads like that. It completely changes the feel in a good way, I think. You can still play the classic way with a little stick if you want to, but this opens up, to me, new possibilities. I've mentioned multiple times that I'm interested in developing a game for a retro machine like the Amstrad in this case, and when I do that, I'm going to be very tempted to make sure that it works with multiplayer gamepads, just like this. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this quick episode. If so, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Until next video, see you then. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting Noel's Retro Lab on Patreon or joining the membership on YouTube. Not only is that the best way to support this channel and allow me to continue making more videos, but you also get some extra perks like early access, ad-free videos, and more. Thank you again to all the supporters. See you next time.